Hi, everyone. Happy holiday and welcome to the December meeting of the Linnean Society of New York. I'm Debbie Mullins, the president, and I call the meeting to order. We're glad you've joined us tonight to hear Christina Riehl's presentation on the really fascinating reproductive behavior of the greater Ani. But before the program begins, I have just a few announcements. The Christmas bird counts begin this weekend. The Brooklyn count is Saturday and the New York County count is Sunday. The New York City Bird Alliance's website has links to register for all these and other local counts. If you're from Long Island or upstate, you can find information on your county's CBC on the website of the New York State Ornithological Association, nisoa.org. The Christmas bird counts and the compilation at the end of the day is always a lot of fun, so don't miss out, but you do need to register to participate. You've been hearing from us this fall about the Horseshoe Crab Protection Act. This legislation would set strict limits on the number of crabs that can be taken in New York waters. The bill requires Governor Hochul's signature to become law, but she has not yet signed the bill, and now there are only a few days left for her to sign. As you know, horseshoe crab eggs are a critical food source for the endangered red knot and other migratory shorebirds. But due to overharvesting, due to the use of crabs for bait and for their blood to test for contaminants in sterile biomedical products, their numbers have declined to unhealthy levels. Other states, including Connecticut and New Jersey, have taken steps to protect their horseshoe crabs, and New York should do the same. Please contact Governor Hochul tonight, if possible, at correspondence.office@exec.ny.gov. That's correspondence.office@exec.ny.gov. This information was also posted on Discord in the statewide chat on December 3rd by Ann Swain. You can find all the information there. Our field trips are usually suspended during the Christmas bird count period, but they'll begin again in January. And we're in need of volunteer registrars to manage the trips. This is a simple one-off opportunity, and we'll be happy to train you on how to do it. If you'd like to volunteer, please send an email to trips@linneannewyork.org. And finally, we're happy to welcome 6 new members this month. They are Senia Hammer, Stephen Kelly, Mary Kentros, Stephen Kessler, Ann Swain, and Shaul Yahil. Welcome to the Linnean Society. We're happy that you've joined, and I hope you'll find some way to get involved in the Society's activities. If anyone watching is not a member, please join us. If you don't live in the city, our programs are always on Zoom. You can watch from anywhere, and many of our field trips are outside the city. You may even find us at your local patch. The membership application is on our website, linneannewyork.org, under members. Tonight, we're honored to have Dr. Christina Riehl as our speaker. Christina is an associate professor in ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton University. Her research focuses on the evolution of avian life history and reproductive biology, especially social behavior, mating systems, and parental care. She's particularly interested in tropical birds, which exhibit a greater diversity of breeding behaviors than their temperate zone counterparts and remain comparatively understudied. Christina is a fellow of the American Ornithological Society and serves as the editor-in-chief of the journal Ornithology. She received her PhD from Princeton University in 2011 and completed postdoctoral fellowships at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and at the Harvard Society of Fellows before returning to Princeton as a faculty member in 2015. The title of her presentation is Cheaters and Collaborators, the Evolution of Cooperative Behavior in a Tropical Bird. Thank you so much for being here, Christina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Debbie. That was such a nice introduction. Let's see, let me share my screen here. Let's see. Okay. I'm gonna hope that everyone can see that and that you can hear me okay.
Looks great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Okay, yeah, thanks so much for that introduction. So as Debbie said, I'm a professor of biology at Princeton University, where I study these fascinating birds, the greater anis, and lots of other tropical species with interesting mating systems and parental care patterns. But the reason I started studying birds was that I've been a bird watcher since childhood. In fact, the announcements about the Christmas bird counts made me excited because this year I'm going to be doing the New Orleans Christmas bird count, which is where I grew up, and I've done that Christmas bird count every year since I was 15. So I definitely encourage you, if you haven't done Christmas bird counts before, it's a great way to get out and meet other bird watchers and do some birding, get to know your local patches. So to most birders, anis are not the most exciting birds you could see in the tropics. And a lot of bird watchers in the US know anis because they've seen them on trips to Costa Rica or Panama. But compared to toucans and motmots and things like that, anis are not really the flashy birds that birders go there for. But they do have an amazingly intricate and bizarre breeding system. They have really fascinating social behaviors. They breed in groups. They're often referred to as cooperative or communal breeders. I'll talk a bit more about that tonight. And what's unusual about them is that they breed in these communal groups where they raise young sort of as a collective. And the other birds that they're raising young with are not their relatives. They're not their family members. So my research focuses on the evolution of this really unusual breeding system and about the behavioral adaptations that anis demonstrate to living this sort of unusual social life. So I'm going to tell you about some of that research today and sort of place it in the context of the other mating systems and parental care systems that we see across birds. Sorry, I'm trying to advance my slide and it is not working. Okay, this worked just fine in the practice right before. Let's see. Nope, it's totally frozen. Okay, let's try stopping the share and starting it again. Try starting it from the beginning. Okay, yes, technology is great, except when it isn't. Okay, so like I said, if you're a bird watcher, you've probably seen other anis, maybe in the US or maybe on trips to the tropics. The anis are often confused for blackbirds. In fact, even a lot of birders think that they're blackbirds, but they're not. They're cuckoos. They're a small group within the cuckoo family. There are 4 species in that group. The greater ani is one, the one I study. These are smooth-billed anis, which you might see in southern Florida or in Mexico, in the Caribbean. They're all over the Caribbean, all over Central America. And the groove-billed ani, a species you might see in the Rio Grande in Texas. And there's a 4th species, the guira cuckoo, which doesn't look anything like the anis, but has a similar communal breeding system. So these 4 species are really similar in their social behaviors and in their breeding system. So they're all communal nesters. These smooth-billed anis are probably members of a breeding group here, huddled up on a branch together. And what communal nesters do is they're species in which more than one pair builds a nest and they all reproduce in the same shared nest. So these are our greater anis. This is the species I study. They're more Amazonian in their distribution than the other ani species that I've mentioned before. So unless you've been to Panama or South America, you probably haven't seen the greater ani. But this photo is showing you two pairs, and the males and females in the anis look identical. So you can't tell a male from a female apart, but this is actually two breeding pairs, and they're all adults, and they build a single nest together. The females lay their eggs in the same nest, and they cooperatively share parental care of the mixed brood of young. So this is what a greater ani nest looks like. This is a communal nest that's been built by 3 different pairs. And there are 10 eggs in this nest, and they've been laid by 3 different females. And as you can see, the eggs look very similar to each other. They're not spotted. They don't have distinctive patternings or size. And the females actually can't tell their own eggs apart from the eggs of other females. And of course, the males don't know whose eggs are whose either. And so the females lay all of their eggs in this single communal nest. And the different pairs that are part of the same social group actually share parental care of everything. So they build the nest together, they take turns incubating the eggs, they all deliver food to the young. This is a picture of a greater ani nest from a nest camera, and it's sort of looking down on the nest from above. And this is one pair of anis in the act of building the nest. There's a female sitting on the nest, and she's got a green leaf in her bill that her male mate there has just brought to her. So if you were to watch this nest for any period of time, you'd see this pair building at the nest for a while, then they might fly off and another pair would come in and add some leaves to the nest or add some sticks. And sometimes you see many birds at the nest at the same time. This is, again, a photo from a nest camera showing a clutch of young that have hatched. The nestlings are in the middle of the nest there. And all 4 of the breeding adults in this group, this is a group with only 2 breeding pairs, has arrived to the nest, and they're all sort of waiting their turn to feed the chicks. You can actually see what they have in their bills here. They eat a lot of big insects. They're large insect specialists, so they eat grasshoppers, katydids, cicadas, roaches, small vertebrates like lizards, things like that. And so anis have a bunch of different ways of breeding in a group. The simplest groups, as I mentioned, are groups that contain only 2 pairs. So these are all reproductive birds as two breeding pairs. And this is sort of the core ani group. There's the smallest a group can be. About 30%, between 20 and 30% of the breeding groups that I study consist of 3 pairs. And usually these form when there's an existing 2-pair group and a 3rd pair joins that group and makes it into a 3-pair group. In theory, you could have sort of 3-pair groups forming de novo, but in practice, what usually happens is it's pairs joining or leaving an already existing group with 2 pairs. So you could have 4 birds or 6 birds. But that's not all. Some ani groups also have non-breeding helpers. And these are birds that don't breed, they don't lay eggs in the nest, they don't reproduce, but they just assist the breeders in raising the young. And many times those helpers are relatives of at least one of the breeding pairs in the group. So sometimes those helpers are young birds that were produced by the group the previous year. And instead of dispersing and going off to breed on their own, they actually help their parents and their co-parents, their alloparents, raise more young. But sometimes these helpers are unrelated immigrants that are not related to any of the breeding pairs in the group, and instead are birds that are sort of floating around looking for groups to join and trying to become breeders. And these unrelated helpers can join groups and not have a social mate, right? So they're not mated to another bird, but they're just helping the breeding pairs raise young. And the related helpers and the unrelated helpers act about the same. You can't tell which are family members and which are not. And the adults in these groups are typically not related to each other. Very, very rarely we have a case where brothers might breed in the same group, but that's pretty unusual. Most of the time, the adults in these breeding groups they're not family members, they're not related to each other. So your typical ani breeding group usually has between 4 and 8 birds in it, depending on how many breeding pairs and how many helpers there are. But anis never nest as lone pairs, which is also quite weird. In the greater ani, I've actually never, over like almost 20 years studying these birds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nests, I've never found a nest that was built by just one pair. They seem to be obligate cooperative breeders. That is, they have to breed in a group. The other anis are not like that. The smooth-billed and groove-billed anis can breed as lone pairs, or they can breed communally as the greater anis do. But there's one additional breeding strategy that anis can do, another way they can reproduce, and that is that some females, instead of being part of a breeding group, they actually act as what's known as brood parasites. So they lay their eggs into the nest of a breeding group, but then they don't stay and provide parental care. They abandon the group and they go elsewhere. So there are a lot of different ways of being an ani. You could be a breeder in a group, you could be a helper, or you could be a parasite. And most individuals act in these different roles at various points over their lives. They start out as helpers, they become breeders, and then most females at some point start to act as parasites or lay parasitically too, in addition to nesting. So I'm often asked, this sounds so bizarre. This is so weird for birds to have this communal breeding system. How common is this? And the answer is it's not very common, but there are a handful of birds that are communal breeders. There are several species that are cooperative breeders that have non-breeding helpers, but we're not used to thinking about birds reproducing in these different and diverse ways, because in the temperate zone, the vast majority of birds that we're used to seeing when we go outside in North America are breeding as just socially monogamous pairs. So monogamy, where a male and female share a pair bond, with biparental care, where both the male and the female provide some degree of parental care to the offspring, is really the norm across birds in North America. So things from great blue herons to cormorants to robins, the Canada geese that I'm sure you guys will have breeding in a couple months, even in Manhattan. These are all species where they're socially monogamous with biparental care. But that's not the only breeding system that exists in birds. We do have a few representatives in North America of tropical families that have different breeding systems. So all of the hummingbirds, for example, have female-only parental care, where the female mates with the male, but the male doesn't help build the nest or incubate the nestlings. The female does all of it. Another breeding system that you might have heard of before is the reverse, where there's male parental care and females mate with several different males. This is an Audubon plate of a Wilson's phalarope. So phalaropes have this interesting breeding system. And they also have reversed sexual dimorphism, where the female is actually the more colorful, more flashy sex, and the males are duller. And Audubon and many of the early illustrators famously reversed the sexes on their paintings because they thought the more colorful bird was the male, and it's actually the female. So phalaropes and some of the shorebirds, like spotted sandpipers that we see on migration, these have male parental care, and they breed farther north of us rather than farther south of us. And I mentioned cooperative breeders. So greater anis with their non-breeding helpers, that the sort of having a breeding pair with non-breeding helpers is often referred to as cooperative breeding rather than the communal breeding, where you've got several reproductive females. And cooperative breeders are very rare in the US, but there are a few. Probably the best studied, or one of the best studied, is the Florida scrub jay, where a breeding pair is assisted by their young offspring that fledged the previous year and don't disperse, but instead they help their parents raise siblings most of the time. This is a picture of Florida scrub jays. It's kind of a funny picture. It was taken quite a while ago, where a mother and a daughter, her daughter, the helper, are both trying to incubate the eggs at the same time. And here's the breeding male. So this daughter isn't reproducing. She's just helping her parents raise siblings. And finally, there's even a few birds you might be familiar with where they lack parental care altogether. I'm sure you guys have seen brown-headed cowbirds, which are brood parasites, where cowbirds lay their eggs in the nests of other species, and the host species, like this chipping sparrow or a cardinal, wind up raising the baby brown-headed cowbirds. So, for a behavioral ecologist or for an evolutionary biologist, especially someone like me coming from a birding background, the challenge is trying to understand why different species of birds have such different mating systems. Like, why do we see this diversity? And why do some species have male-only parental care, others have female-only parental care? Why do you see the evolution of brood parasitism where adults actually lose parental care behaviors? And so from that perspective, just looking at the diversity of parental care patterns, cuckoos are a really fascinating family to study because cuckoos show an enormous diversity of breeding systems and parental care behaviors. So in North America, the cuckoos we're most familiar with, at least in the East, are the yellow-billed and black-billed cuckoos. And they're interesting because, like most of the temperate birds I mentioned before, yellow and black-billed cuckoos are socially monogamous with biparental care, but they're facultative brood parasites. So they occasionally dump their eggs into the nests of other cuckoos or sometimes even other species, which is very unusual. It's very unusual for a species to be like a facultative brood parasite on other species. It doesn't happen very much. So even the apparently traditional socially monogamous cuckoos that we have, they show their cuckoo roots a little bit in their flexibility, their willingness to parasitize other species. And if you look across the cuckoos, it's a pretty big family. It's about 144, 145 species. And they're distributed globally. They're most diverse in the tropics, but they include things like the road runners and the ground cuckoos, the anis, as I mentioned, the kuas of Madagascar, the cuckoos of Africa, and then there's a very, very large group of cuckoos that contains most of the old world cuckoos, those in Europe and Asia and Africa, and some of the new world cuckoos like the yellow-billed and black-billed cuckoos belong to that group. But what's cool about the cuckoos, like I said, is just that they have this tremendous diversity of breeding systems. Basically, you can find all of the breeding systems found in birds almost in the cuckoos in this one family. So there are species with male-only parental care. There are species with biparental care that are socially monogamous. That's probably the ancestral state. There are, of course, the obligate brood parasitic cuckoos, famously the old world common cuckoo, and you've got the anis, which are the communal nesters. So the old world cuckoos, there are a couple of different origins of brood parasitism within that family, meaning it's evolved independently a few different times in the same family. The best studied is the common cuckoo of Eurasia. Whoops. And common cuckoos, as you've probably heard, they parasitize other species. The females remove a host egg and they lay their egg in the nest of the host species, and they abandon parental care to the host species. And so even though this nest down here looks like it has 4 very similar eggs, you can see that one of them is a little bit bigger. That's a common cuckoo egg in a reed warbler nest. And when the cuckoo chick hatches, it hatches before the warbler chicks do, and the cuckoo chick will push the rest of the host eggs out of the nest. So it's pretty bad for the reed warblers. It gives rise to this sort of ridiculous result that you've probably seen in nature documentaries and things like that. And so that brings us back to the anis. So in the context of the diversity of breeding systems and parental care systems that I've mentioned, and in the context of the cuckoos, the anis also kind of do it all, because you have sort of these biparental system, you have these pairs of birds in these groups, but they can also act as helpers with as sort of traditional cooperative breeders, or they can act as brood parasites. And one of the prevailing hypotheses for how their unique communal breeding system evolved is actually that it was related to brood parasitism. Because if you imagine a female ani that lays her egg in the nest of a different female ani and then abandons it and lets the host provide parental care, that would be a brood parasite, right? That female is acting as a parasite. But if that female instead stays at the nest and provides parental care, then it becomes a communal group and it becomes cooperative. And so the fact that we still see both of these strategies in the anis, both the communal nesting and the parasitism, gives us a really cool opportunity to try to understand why evolution can produce this diversity of breeding systems, why selection might favor females that parasitize in one instance or cooperate in another instance. So I've been studying greater anis since I was in graduate school, almost 20 years now. And I've mainly studied them in Panama, in central Panama here. That's that inset on the left, at a site operated by the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute called Barrow, Colorado Island, which is a tropical field station. It's sort of a hub for tropical research of lots of different things, not just birds, but plants and soils. And sort of a mecca for tropical biologists. And Barrow, Colorado Island was created when the Panama Canal was created over 100 years ago. It used to be a hilltop, and it was turned into an island when the Chagres River was dammed to create Gatun Lake, which is part of the Panama Canal. So in this photograph, what you're looking down on is Barrow, Colorado Island in the middle, with these container ships going past it on the upper right, going through the Panama Canal. And all of these red dots that I've placed on the photograph are actually locations of communal ani nests. And although I didn't know it when I started studying these birds in graduate school, greater anis turn out to be a wonderful species to study because they don't migrate in Panama. They're sedentary. They stay on their territories year round. They build their nests in all birds will be staying together. So these birds are really alloparents to each other's young. So this is what the field site looks like. This is it's sort of lowland tropical wet forest. It stays green year round, although there is a rainy season and a dry season. And greater anis nest along the shoreline of vegetation, not just here, but throughout their range. They like to nest in emergent vegetation, so in marshy vegetation or swampy vegetation that's surrounded by water, or in tree branches that hang over the water. They like to stay as close to the water as they can to avoid nest predators like snakes and monkeys that are common in tropical forests. Down here, I don't know if you guys can actually see my cursor where I'm pointing, but if you look in the middle of this big fig branch that's hanging over the water, you can see sort of a messy clump of sticks, and that's an ani nest in the water there. They also like to nest in emergent vegetation. As I mentioned, this is pond apple. And again, it's safer to nest in sites that are surrounded by water. So that means all of our work has to be done by boat. We go around in small motorboats and we find these nests every year. This is my longtime field assistant, Megan Strong, she's processing an ani egg. What she's actually doing is taking a sample of DNA from the outside of the egg so that we can genotype that DNA and tell which female laid that egg. Here is a different photograph. You can actually see a smear of blood on the egg in the upper right there. That's blood that the female left on the egg when she laid it. And we can actually take a sample of that blood and you do molecular analyses to tell who laid it, which female laid that egg. And so we find these nests every year. We keep track of all of the eggs in the clutches. We capture the adults and we take blood samples and we put color bands on their legs so we can identify them. And when the chicks hatch, we put bands on the chicks as well, and we take blood samples from them. And we use nest cameras like this one to watch the behaviors of the adults at the nest and the nestlings when we're not there. So we can look at who is providing parental care, interactions between the adults at the nest, and things like that. And so when I first started studying anis, I was really intrigued by the very basic question of why, like why do they breed in these groups? This is rare across birds, and there are real costs to breeding communally. You're sort of in competition with your close allies here in these groups. And so I really wanted to understand the costs and the benefits of breeding cooperatively. And when I started studying greater anis, no one had really studied this species before. Their natural history was not very well known. It was known that they were communal breeders, but that was about it. And I happened to start studying them just at the right time. It was really when molecular techniques for genotyping adults and looking at parentage and relatedness, like genetic relationships between individuals in these groups, these techniques were just starting to become widely available and easy to use in the field. And so I was able to try to look at things like, why these unrelated birds are breeding together, who's reproducing in the nest, how many nestlings each of these adults is producing, and who they're mating with, and things like that. So I mentioned that, breeding in groups, there are costs and benefits, right? And as evolutionary biologists, we try to understand these costs and benefits to sort of understand why breeding systems evolve in the first place. Why don't these birds just breed as monogamous pairs with biparental care like other birds do? So the benefits, it turns out, were pretty hard to document, but the costs were really obvious. So one of these costs had been reported even before I started studying anis. Sandy Varenkamp had seen this years ago in groove-billed anis, which were the species that had been studied in Costa Rica before I started my research. And in groove-billed anis, and in greater anis as well, one of the main costs of communal nesting is that females actually compete with each other in these groups, particularly over laying their eggs. So in ani groups, in all of them, smooth-billed anis, greater anis, groove-billed anis, even the guira cuckoos, females can't recognize their own eggs, but they do know when they've laid an egg. So if a female hasn't laid an egg yet, a female who hasn't laid, if she comes to the nest and finds that one of her fellow group members has laid an egg in the nest, that female who hasn't laid yet will push the egg out of the nest. And I have videos of this, but because we're over Zoom, I'm just going to show you a series of still photos taken from a video. So what you're seeing here is a greater ani nest with an egg in it. A female has laid an egg. And this greater ani here is a female who hasn't laid yet. And she comes to the nest. She looks at the egg, she reaches down in the nest with her bill, and she scoops the egg up onto the rim of the nest. And then she uses her bill to push the egg off the rim of the nest. So she's just evicted this egg from the nest. And this happens 100% of the time in greater ani nests, groove-billed ani nests as well. The first egg that's laid in one of these communal nests, by definition, there's always going to be a female in a group who hasn't laid yet, right? If the first egg is laid, there's someone around who hasn't laid yet, and that female will always push the egg out of the nest. But once a female has started laying eggs, then she no longer pushes eggs out of the nest. She doesn't destroy eggs anymore, likely because at that point she would risk destroying her own eggs. And so what happens in ani nests is this very predictable stereotyped pattern of egg destruction, where the first egg to be laid in a sequence, here we'll say it's by female A, that egg is always destroyed because female B hasn't started laying yet. And so female B removes that egg from the nest. But once female B starts laying, then both A and B have laid at least one egg. And at that point, neither of them will remove eggs. They'll just continue to lay eggs and let eggs accumulate in the clutch just fine. And then they'll incubate the clutch and everything's okay. Sometimes the two females are not well synchronized. They're not really on the same page about when to start laying. So if one female starts laying before the other female, say female A lays 2 eggs or 3 eggs or 4 eggs before female B starts laying, all those early laid eggs will be ejected by the second female. And it gets even worse if you've got highly out of sync females, where you have female A might lay 4 eggs before female B starts and things like that. The same pattern holds and gets even more complicated if you have 3 females, because then A and B have to start laying and C before all of the eggs can remain in the nest. So this is a really interesting behavior, and it's an interesting pattern, because what it means is that when these females contribute eggs to the clutch, each female gets the opportunity to lay. It's impossible for female A to sort of monopolize the clutch by laying a whole bunch of her eggs before the other females are ready. She can't do that. She has to wait until all the other females are ready to lay before her eggs will stay in the nest. So there are some really funny early descriptions of ani nests where people find nests with many eggs that have been ejected underneath the nest. There are reports of smooth-billed ani nests with like 25 or 30 eggs that have been ejected from the nest and are lying under the nest. We don't get quite that high numbers in the greater ani. Their groups are a bit more organized. But what it does mean is that it places a really hard upper limit on the number of females in these groups, because if you imagine the difficulties in coordinating reproduction with 2 females or 3 females, that just goes up exponentially with 4 females or even 5 females. And I have seen groups this large. And as you can see, the number of eggs ejected goes up because those early laying females have their eggs ejected before the last females in the group are ready to lay. And what normally happens with these very large groups is that the groups usually abandon the nest, or at least some of the pairs leave the group. And just so a group that started out with 4 pairs might be down to 3 pairs or 2 pairs by the time the females have all started laying. And when I first started this work, I was really interested in trying to understand who goes first, right? Like, what determines whether a female is female A versus female B or female C? And I can remember people getting really excited and generating all kinds of incredible hypotheses about maybe older females should go first, maybe younger females should go first, dominant females or subordinate females. And I looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find anything that would allow you to predict which female in a group is going to be the first laying female or the last laying female. It doesn't seem to matter how old they are, or whether they're heavier or in good condition, or whether they've been in the group for longer. And in fact, if you look at the same group over time at repeated nesting attempts by the same females, it actually changes. So the female that was female A in one nesting attempt might be female B next time. It seems to actually be pretty random. But what it means is that over time, everyone goes first at some point. If you're in the group for long enough, you will have your turn at being female A or female B or female C. And so the costs of losing these eggs actually equalize across group members over time. And the big benefit of nesting in groups turns out to be linked to nest predation. So I mentioned before that anis like to nest in emergent vegetation or in vegetation hanging over the water because monkeys and snakes are the major nest predators. And actually, monkeys and snakes eat tons and tons more eggs than ejection destroys eggs. So competition among females destroys only a small, tiny fraction of eggs compared to what predators do. So nest predators, like snakes and monkeys, they typically will go to nests and eat eggs. Often snakes will take eggs like one at a time over the course of several weeks. But larger groups seem better able to defend their nests against these nest predators. Anis are pretty big birds, and they mob predators. So a group of 6 anis or 8 anis attacking a snake is actually a pretty formidable opponent, and they can drastically reduce the odds that a nest will be destroyed by predators. These are just some data just showing you the raw proportion of nests that are essentially where all of the eggs are eaten by predators as a function of the total size of the group. So this is the number of adults in the group, both breeding adults plus their helpers. And you can see there's a pretty strong linear decrease in the likelihood that a nest will get depredated by predators and the size of the group. But what you'll also notice here is something interesting, which is that the sample sizes I'm giving above these bars. So for example, a group with 4 birds, that's only 2 breeding pairs, the smallest group, they have the highest rates of nest predation, between 60 and 70%, but they're also the most common group size. 217 of those is compared to 48 2-pair groups with a helper, that's 5 birds, 66 groups with 6 birds, and only 25 groups with 7 birds. So these groups here with 7 would be 3 breeding pairs and 1 helper. So it's interesting because the small groups have the highest rates of predation, but they're actually the most common nesting groups. So as a result of the larger groups having lower rates of predation, large groups also fledge more young. I'm showing here the proportion of nests that are successful in black, and the number of fledglings that each breeding bird produces in white here on the same graph. And you can see that birds in 3-pair groups typically do better. 20 or 30% of groups are actually large like this. And when we continued to investigate anis over a longer time period, what I realized was that actually there's something more complicated going on here with group size. It's not so simple as I thought in the early years of the study, where I thought that large groups just had higher reproductive output because they could defend the nestlings better. It's much more complicated than that, because it turns out that that advantage of group size is actually somewhat dependent on weather. When I started studying anis, the first several years of the study were very wet years. They had high rainfall, and that was produced by this climate phenomenon known as the El Nino Southern Oscillation. You guys have probably heard of El Ninos. In North America, El Ninos produce sort of warm, mild winters for us. In Panama, El Nino years produce very dry breeding seasons for greater anis. So El Nino years are very dry years with not very much rainfall and not very much food. And the anis do terribly in El Nino years. Most of them actually don't reproduce at all. We have much lower rates of even attempting to nest in El Nino years. And there's much less food for the birds that do breed in dry years. And it turns out that this climate phenomenon has a really interesting interaction with group size. So when I was studying the anis in the early years of the study, when it was quite wet, I was seeing that the larger groups were actually doing better. But it turns out that's only true in wet years. In dry years, the large groups actually do substantially worse than two-pair groups. And we think that's because the larger groups have larger clutches. And even though they have more caregivers to feed those nestlings, the number of mouths to feed increases faster than the number of adults that are feeding them. And so we see sort of disproportionate starvation in large clutches with these large groups in very dry years. And so, And so it turns out that actually being in a small group versus a large group, the costs and benefits of that vary over time. It depends on sort of the snapshot of years you're looking in. But if you look over the long term, two-pair groups and three-pair groups actually don't have very different reproductive output. Over the long term, they sort of average out, which is interesting. And finally, another question that I've spent a lot of time tackling over the years is the question of conspecific brood parasitism in the anis. So I mentioned before that anis have this, sort of sneaky reproductive strategy where females can lay eggs in the nests of other groups. And when I first started studying anis and genotyping eggs, at first I thought this was a mistake. I would occasionally find an egg where the genotype of the egg didn't match any of the females in the group. And I thought, well, this is probably just genotyping error because, it's a low percentage. And I was ignoring them for several years until we actually saw some interactions at nests where we saw what looked like extra group females, like females that weren't part of that social group, approaching the nest and being chased off by members of the social group. And so once I saw that interaction, I thought, oh, wait a minute, maybe those weren't mistakes after all. Maybe those eggs were actually parasitic eggs. And so we started looking at it more carefully. And we started tracking, how many eggs appear in the nest on a given day, trying to tell, okay, wait, this egg couldn't have been laid by a group member because all the females already laid. Anis can only lay one egg every 2 days, so it's pretty easy to tell when extra eggs appear in the nest that shouldn't be there, even without the genetics. So I wanted to understand this because, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the prevailing hypotheses for how this communal breeding system evolved was through sort of a conspecific brood parasitism behavior, through parasitism of other nests of the same species. And so I wanted to understand the costs and benefits of parasitism in the same way that I had tried to understand the costs and benefits of communal nesting. So I showed you earlier the pictures of these ani eggs. And if you look closely, you can see that these eggs are kind of weird looking. When ani eggs are freshly laid, they are white in appearance, but that white is actually a chalky coating on the outside of the egg. It's concealing a blue shell underneath. So ani eggs, the shell is blue. It's blue pigment, just like a robin's egg, but it has this white chalky coating of a polymorph of calcium carbonate called vaterite on the outside. And this chalky coating gets scraped off over the course of incubation to reveal the blue shell underneath. So when we were looking at these nests in the field, my field assistants and I, we could always tell when an egg was freshly laid and when a clutch had been incubated for a while, because if you find a clutch of blue eggs, you can tell, okay, these eggs have been here for a while. Whereas if you find a clutch of white eggs, you know that they've been freshly laid. And over the course of incubation, the white wears off until the eggs are mostly blue by the end of incubation. And we thought, well, we can recognize freshly laid eggs. I wonder if the anis can recognize freshly laid eggs, because brood parasites often don't time their laying to synchronize with the host groups. Brood parasites pretty much lay their eggs whenever they can, whenever they have an opportunity to put an egg in a nest with eggs, at least the anis do. And so we looked at the sort of progression of these eggs from sort of white eggs to blue eggs to see whether we could understand whether the anis were paying attention to this color change and using it to determine when eggs had been laid in the communal clutch. Given that they can't recognize whose eggs is whose, maybe they could just recognize when the eggs were laid. And we found that parasitic eggs are often laid at the quote unquote wrong time. This is a picture of an ani nest, and as you can see, these eggs are very blue. These eggs are pretty old eggs. They look like they are about to hatch. And here's a white parasitic egg in the middle. And so the parasitic eggs that we see that anis can also see. And anis will often eject these parasitic eggs when they're laid at the wrong time, probably because they just look so mismatched compared to the host clutch. But parasitic eggs also have pretty low hatching success compared to the eggs of the birds that are in the breeding group. And that's not just because the hosts recognize them, it's also because they're laid too late. They typically either don't hatch at all or they hatch after all of the other chicks have hatched, sort of the opposite from what you would expect a really good brood parasite to do. And so that raises the question of why females act as parasites at all. And this has traditionally been a really difficult question to answer, especially for species that parasitize other members of the same species, the conspecific brood parasites, because it's really hard to track these females down. You know, you find an egg in a nest and you don't know who's laid it or where that female is or what her reproductive history is. But in our case, we had a really unique opportunity to be able to answer this question because we had been following females in this study population for so long, and we had genotyped so many eggs that we had a pretty good database of all of the genotypes of eggs that females had laid and where those females were coming from and who they were. So we looked at almost 2,000 eggs over 10 years and genotyped those eggs to 210 females. And we tried to ask, you know, where parasitic eggs were coming from, who those females were, and what happened to them. And what we found was that of the 65 parasitic eggs where we could track the mother of those eggs and we knew where she had come from, almost all of them, 55 of 65 eggs, were laid by females who actually were part of social groups. They weren't sort of special parasites hanging around on the fringes, parasitizing instead of being part of a cooperative group. Instead, what was happening was that these were females who had begun the breeding season as cooperators, as part of a social group. But if their nest was destroyed by predators, particularly if predators found the nest while the females were still laying, then those females who were in the middle of their laying sequence would switch to becoming parasites and would lay their eggs in the nests of neighboring groups mostly. Not all of them did this. A lot of females simply waited until next year. You know, when their nests were predated or destroyed by predators, most females would just stop laying then. But some of them, a minority of females, took this sort of parasitic route and instead dumped their eggs into the nests of their neighbors. And so those are just a couple of the different questions I've worked on the anis over the years. But I wanted to make sure it's 7:50 now. I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for questions at the end and discussion, because giving a talk over Zoom is different from giving a talk to a live audience in that I can't see you guys and I can't see what your reactions are. So I thought I would give us a little bit of time at the end for you to answer for you to ask questions and me to answer them. And I'll just end by saying that I hope that for the birders in the audience, maybe next time you go to the tropics, you'll pay attention to the anis. Make sure you identify which ones are groove-billed and which ones are smooth-billed. They're very frequently misidentified. And all of the anis share this really interesting communal breeding behavior. And the other species, there's still a lot left to be known about them. So next time you're in the field looking at an ani, look for its nest and see if you can see some of these piles of eggs underneath the nest, maybe. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. And thank you so much to Debbie and Michelle and Doug for inviting me to give this talk. Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, very good. So I'm Doug. I'm the vice president of the Linnean Society, and my task is to invite questions and to read them to you. They will be typed in coming from the audience. But first, uh, let me say how much I enjoyed your talk. I remember you came to Stony Brook some years ago and gave an earlier version of this talk, and it's just as fascinating this time as it was the first time I heard it.
Thank you,
And
Doug.
uh, so I'm trying to see whether we have any. Not sure I know what I'm doing. Are there any questions? Participants raise hands.
I
Okay.
can see some questions in the Q&A at the
Right,
bottom.
and I just discovered them. And so so first Barbara's remarks, not a question, but just stating that this is incredibly fascinating research. And
Oh, thank you, Barbara.
I'm sure that many of us in the audience, most would agree with that. And one of our respected senior members, Robert Paxton, asks, are the members of a cooperative breeding group sexually promiscuous within the group?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'm sorry that I had to race through so many important facets of their natural history, but the answer is no. They're not promiscuous. The breeding pairs within a group are behaviorally monogamous. That is, they act like mated pairs. They stick together, they preen each other, just like you know, biparental birds do when they're not in cooperative groups. And genetically, if you look at the nestlings in a clutch, about 85 to 90% of them are produced by socially monogamous pairs, meaning that about 10 to 15% of them are produced outside the pair bond by extra pair mating within the same social group. But that's actually pretty common for birds. Like a extra pair mating rate of 10 to 15% is not particularly high, particularly if you consider that these are all birds breeding at the same time in the same nest. 10 to 15% actually seems pretty low to me. So they're not promiscuous. They're about as monogamous as most socially monogamous birds are.
Mm-hmm. Kelly says, you mentioned competition between females. Have you noticed any competition between males?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So there's actually, I mean, I talked about sort of the most obvious form of competition, which is females destroying each other's eggs. But actually, there are a lot of other instances of conflict between group members. So males compete with each other in more subtle ways. I mean, first, they do by guarding their mates. I mentioned the fact that they're not promiscuous, right? And that happens because the males and females stick pretty close together. And so the males are clearly, you know, guarding the females. They're guarding their mates. They're sticking close to them because they don't want, they want to retain their paternity, their parentage within the nest. The males also, how else do they compete with each other? There's a fair bit of competition at the beginning of the breeding season when the sort of membership of these groups is getting settled. And quite frequently, both males and females will prevent other pairs from joining the group. So that's probably the biggest instance we see of social conflict is like you'll have a breeding group and they're set and they want to breed together and there's another pair that wants to join the group. And you very frequently see chases and fights between those birds where the sort of core members of the group are trying to repel another pair. Sometimes, particularly in groups with 3 pairs, there is aggression from 2 of the pairs towards the 3rd pair. And we think that's reflecting cases where a pair has managed to lay eggs in the nest. So they've basically sort of entered the nesting cycle almost parasitically, and they're trying to become members of the breeding group, but the core breeding group doesn't want them there. The original 2 pairs don't want them there. And so we see a lot of aggression in that case too. Much of it is directed towards the females though, because the females are the ones that have to lay the eggs in the nest. But some of the aggression does come from males. So I mentioned females a lot in my talk, mostly because we have a lot more data on females because we can genotype the eggs. And so we know which females laid the eggs. We only know about the males if we can genotype the males and then also genotype their nestlings. But because most of the nests are depredated, we just don't have as much genetic data on the males as we do on the females.
Mm-hmm. So Michelle asks a couple of questions that I think many of us will have occurred to many of us. Do Anis do cooperative breeding in the same groups for several years in a row? Do they have, you know, consistent associations? Are they okay? Well, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. So they do. There's a huge range. Many groups form and the birds in that group only breed together for 1 year. And then for whatever reason, those groups dissolve and we never see those birds associating together again. But they can breed together for a very long time. The average is about 4 years. So on average, pairs will stay in the same group with the same social associates for about 4 years. But I think our maximum now is up to like 13 years. That we've had the same birds breeding together in the same group. So it can be, you know, over a decade that they stay together. And I think it's really interesting because, you know, in the literature on parental care in birds, there's been a lot of research done on kind of the benefits of staying with the same social mate, because if you're providing biparental care, there's a, you know, sort of a benefit in being familiar with your co-parent, right? You're raising young together. And so if you know that individual and if you know that you work well together, there's a benefit to staying with that rather than, you know, sort of the avian equivalent of divorce, right? And I think we actually see the same kinds of dynamics happening in the Anis, because if you think about it, in a species with biparental care, what keeps the male and the female together is their shared interest in raising the clutch. But in greater Anis, it's the same thing. They have a shared interest in raising their clutch and they're familiar with each other. And we've actually even seen some benefits, particularly again to females, the ones that we have the more data on. We've seen benefits to females of staying with the same co-breeding females rather than switching groups, mostly in synchronizing their egg laying. Like females that have bred together before can synchronize their egg laying faster. They can coordinate their reproduction more quickly than females that have never bred together before.
Michelle also asked a simple question: how do you distinguish males and females?
Yeah, great question. The easiest way to do it is by taking a blood sample and using a genetic test, a molecular test. But of course you can, and if you do that with banded birds, you can do that. You can band a bird with a combination of color bands, and then you know which ones are males and females based on tests that you can do on their DNA. But there are also behavioral ways of doing it. And in the field, greater anis lay rather large eggs, and when a female is gravid, when she is about to lay an egg, you can actually see a visible bulge. And so when during that laying season, it's actually really easy to tell the females, because if you see a female with a big bulge, you know that's a female. And you can usually tell their social mate as well. If you just watch them, you can tell which ones are paired with which ones. And other behaviors that are good tip-offs are things like if you see a copulation, you can tell which one is the male and which one's the female. But most of it is genetic. Like, I mean, by far, you know, the reason that we know the sexes of most of the birds in the study area is because we've genotyped them, and we've done genetic tests back in the lab in Princeton to tell which are males and females.
So, I mean, I think years ago I read some of Sandy Verenkamp's work on the groove-billed Ani, and I wouldn't think that what you're describing would necessarily apply there, or does it? In the groove-billed,
For what? For the
or distinguishing sexes.
For the molecular techniques, or for seeing
Yeah. I wouldn't imagine that she would have had molecular data.
Oh, exactly. Right. Yes. No. So yeah, I mentioned Sandy's work earlier because she did really the classic foundational work describing this breeding system in groove-billed anis, but she was doing it in the 80s, and
Right.
it was really hard to I don't think she was able to do any sort of molecular work on parentage or anything like that, and I think even molecular sexing might have been pretty tough then. So yeah, like I said, the reason that I was able to do this project was that I sort of came across it at just the right time when Sandy Verenkamp's work had sort of set the stage for the questions, but we had all these new techniques coming online for the molecular analyses that made it possible.
So we have a question from Steve. What is the purpose of the white coating on the shell? Is it for physical protection, for disguise, as a timing mechanism, telling white from blue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so this vaterite coating is really weird. It turns up in a few different lineages of birds, like across the avian evolutionary family tree, across the avian phylogeny, but it's not very predictable. So actually anhingas also have it. Anhingas and cormorants also have this vaterite coating. And so the short answer is we don't know for sure why it evolved. I don't think that it evolved for a single signaling purpose. My guess is that it evolved for a different purpose. And we did some tests on the vaterite coating because I thought that perhaps it was it had to do with gas exchange across the shell during incubation. And so we did some different tests. We tried to tell whether we, artificially removed the vaterite coating from shells, and we measured the rates of gas exchange across the shell membrane during incubation. And we also used I collaborated with a physicist, actually. We used some pretty sophisticated techniques to measure the strength of the eggshell with and without the vaterite coating. And we took these really cool, too bad I don't have them easily at hand, but we took some really cool scanning electron micrograph photos of the vaterite coating, like up close. And what it is it's basically little globules, little balls, almost like styrofoam packing peanuts. Like that's what the surface looks like if you look under an SEM microscope. And the best function we were able to identify is that it makes the shell more resistant to cracking when there's an impact. So if you impact the shell, it crushes the vaterite, but the vaterite sort of makes this buffer, like I said, just like packing peanuts, and it protects the shell and makes it less likely to be cracked. So my guess, although I can't say for sure, my guess is that that its original function probably had more to do with physical protection of the egg, especially because these are very large clutches, and the eggs, when the anis turn the eggs roll around and bang against each other. My guess is it evolved for physical protection, and only after that did it sort of take on the secondary function in signaling. It's such a dramatic change to the eggshell, and the eggshells are pretty constrained. I mean, you can't mess too much with an eggshell. It does a very important purpose. And so I think it's unlikely that this would have evolved just for the signaling function, given that we know it has this sort of protective function as a buffer against cracking. But that's just a guess. We can't really say for sure.
One question that occurred to me is so you've been talking, of course, about groups, but have you ever seen a group form de novo? My impression is that you have all these existing groups, and they may or may not accept a new member from time to time. But how do they form in the first place? Do you have any
Yeah,
idea?
we have seen it. Yeah, we've seen it a lot because every year there are new young birds that are breeding for the first time. So the way they form is that in the non-breeding season, the groups still they stay on their territories and they stay with their social associates, but they roost in these very, very big communal roosts. And in fact, if you've ever been birding in like Ecuador or in the Amazon, you might have seen groups of hundreds of anis together.
Really?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. They're communal roosts. Even in Panama, where the numbers are smaller, they're communal roosts of like between 60 and 120 greater anis. And so in these big, but they only form during the non-breeding season. And these big roosts consist of lots and lots of local breeding groups. So they'll leave their nesting territories, they'll go roost in these big communal roosts, but it also contains lots of young birds that haven't joined a breeding group yet, floaters, immigrants from other areas. And so these are sort of like the melting pots, the social melting pots
Hmm.
during the non-breeding season. And that's where these social associations initially form. So at the end of the non-breeding season, which is the dry season, so at the end of the dry season, you'll start to see groups, basically very loose fluid groups forming that might contain 10 or 12 or 15 birds. And those groups will associate for a while, forage together during the day, roost together at night. And at some point, they become sort of crystallized into smaller groups that are breeding groups. And they do a lot of communal chorusing displays. Again, too bad I can't show a video of this over Zoom, but they get together in these groups and they all call at the same time. And if you've ever seen greater anis, they're incredibly raucous and noisy in these communal calling groups. And so we don't exactly know, of course, how they're choosing who to nest with. You know, it's very hard to answer those kinds of questions, but we do see behaviorally the sort of intermediate stages that go from these sort of big communal roosts down to the more defined breeding groups that then stay together. And that's how they form in the first place. And they often involve young birds breeding with each other. So they often involve pairs that have not bred together before, like young birds or you know, birds that are only a few years old. They start breeding at age 3. So you often see like 3 to 5-year-olds in these groups for the first time. And then as you track adults through their adulthood, the groups become more stable and they sort of tend to remain with the same group for longer as they get older.
Mhm. I'm not seeing any more questions from the audience. Audience members, if you have any questions, please submit them now. I have just one question of my own, which is gets us out of the anis per se. At the start, you noted that essentially the entire family Cuckoolidae has, to a greater or lesser extent, you know, again and again and again, you see various forms of ranging from very slight parasitic tendencies to, you know, to obligate brood parasitism, as in the common cuckoo, the European cuckoo. And I'm curious about where anis fit into this phylogenetically. Are they sort of a basal group showing sort of the first steps toward brood parasitism that then becomes more and more intense and obligate as you sort of, so to speak, move up into more derived groups of cuckoos? Just where?
That's a really great question. I mean, to tell you the truth, it's actually a hard one to answer because, so I showed those 5 major lineages within the cuckoo family. There are 5 subfamilies within the cuckoo family, but the relationships between those 5 subfamilies are not well resolved. The phylogeny is not well resolved because it is a very old group, and the sort of nodes, those lineages go back very deep. So I think the molecular clock phylogeny that I can remember is not very good. It's kind of old at this point. Someone probably needs to do the cuckoo phylogeny with better techniques now that we have better genetic techniques for these sorts of things. But my recollection is that the ani clade is about 16 million years old. And the relationships, I think the anis are most closely related to the roadrunners and the ground cuckoos. And then, I'm sorry?
And are those more basal lineages coming off toward the base of the phylogeny, or, are they very recent?
No, they're not very recent, but the other lineages are old too. Like the divergence times are just very deep for those 5
I see.
lineages. I
Right.
think the better resolved parts of the phylogeny are like the neomorphinae, the New World cuckoos, and many of the Old World are basically the arboreal cuckoos. That's pretty well resolved, but that whole family is not that closely related to the other 4 lineages. So it's hard, like, I don't think the anis are necessarily basal, no, to answer that question. But there is no obvious progression from more parasitic to more derived, or with parasitism being more or less derived within the family, because brood parasitism has evolved, I believe, 3 times within the cuckoos. It's evolved in the New World cuckoos, the striped cuckoo and the pheasant cuckoo and the pavonid cuckoo. That's one origin. And then there are 2 different origins within the neomorphinae. So I think that there's,
The Australian cuckoos would probably be maybe one of those branches.
I think so. I think
The little the shiny bronze shiny cuckoos and those little things there.
I think so. I believe that's right. And I actually can't remember exactly where the 2 different origins within that subfamily fall, but yeah, so and honestly, like all of the lineages have something weird about them. Like the cuckoos, there's a species with reverse sexual dimorphism and male only parental care. And all of these things in the cuckoos, like even the species that have biparental care, like I said, some of them practice this sort of facultative brood parasitism. And I think what I can sort of what I think is the more likely example, the more likely explanation, instead of it being a basal or derived characteristic, is that there seems to be some ancestral characteristics in the cuckoos that all of them share that lead more easily to brood parasitism, to communal nesting, to male only parental care. One of these, for example, is that males provide nocturnal incubation in the cuckoos. And that seems to be a really important thing in birds in general, an important predecessor to many of these bizarre breeding systems, because it basically means that the males are tied up incubating more. They have male biased incubation. Males incubate at night, and that kind of frees the females up to parasitize, to mate with a second male, to become a communal nester. So there's some ancestral things behaviorally as well as sort of morphologically, physiologically. They have very, very flexible egg laying physiology. The common cuckoos are famous for being able to lay many eggs rapidly, and to have their timing of laying be very flexible when there's a good opportunity to parasitize. So I think some of these ancestral physiological and behavioral characteristics are sort of, to use a Stephen Jay Gould term, like pre-adaptations, if you will, to that sort of make it more likely that these other forms of parental care can evolve.
I'm not seeing any other questions. And so I would like to thank you, Christina, for just an
Oh, sorry,
amazing
Doug.
talk about
There is
a.
one more. Sorry, Doug. There's one more
I'm
question.
sorry. Okay, that just appeared. Yes, please. Is there a hormonal basis for role reversal?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks, Debbie.
Yes, I think so. This isn't really my area. I haven't studied the sex role reverse species, but my understanding is that in species with, quote unquote, sex role reversal, where the males do more of the parental care, there are some hormonal correlates, in bird species where females compete for mates and have multiple mates. Those are called the polyandrous species. They do tend to have higher testosterone. But I think that it's very hard to know whether those hormonal differences are actually driving these patterns or whether they're just consequences of these patterns, because, hormones, they are correlated with behaviors. If you inject a bird with testosterone, it becomes more aggressive, but they are also consequences of behaviors. A bird that is given young to provide care for will also show hormonal changes in response to having those parental care behaviors and in response to expressing those parental care behaviors. So yes, there are hormonal differences, but how much of it is cause and how much of it is consequence, I'm not totally sure.
Okay, let me ask, having made an error there, may I ask the audience to submit any more open questions? I'm not seeing any, and so I think with that, I will thank you on behalf of the audience, on the behalf of the Linnean Society. Christina, thanks for a marvelous talk about just a fascinating species and a fascinating life history that you've been able to describe to us tonight. Thank you so much for your talk. Goodbye.
Oh, thank you so much, Doug. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for your questions, and I hope to be able to see you in person at some point too.
Okay, very good. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Take care. Thank you.